Last week we looked at David getting anointed. The Spirit of God comes on David. The Spirit of God leaves Saul. That is a scary thought. And a tormenting spirit is given to him. And because he's reprobate, he's walked away from the Lord. He's stiffened his neck. He's stubborn in his heart. And you think, well, rebellion, witchcraft, how do the two line up? And of course, at the end of his life, he would consult the witch in Endor. God's just saying, this is who you are. And like a Polaroid, give it time to develop. Saul's character developed as the years went on. As Saul is declining and David is being raised up, God is going to get his man in the forefront at his time. He has his way of doing this. So chapter 17 is interesting because for years, Israel's going to war with the Philistines. But at the same time, they're not always winning victories and standing their ground. They had given up some territory, and then we see the two camps facing off in the Valley of Elah. Now, if you've ever been to Israel, you go there, it would look nothing like, ancient Israel. There's like stores there. Our tour guide is like, we'll pull up here off this gas station and go down this hill. It's right over there. You're like, this kind of takes away from the moment. But the two armies faced off in the valley. Between the two of them, there was a valley, as we'll see, and there's a bit of a deadlock. Who's going to fight who based on who's going to send out a champion to fight the other team's champion. Israel is supposed to have Saul, head and shoulders above everybody else. The Philistines have a champion by the name of Goliath. Verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle and were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. Take note of that. They're in Judah, in God's land, their territory. They're standing in Israel's property. They encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Damim, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, about 9 feet, 9 inches tall. Not a bad guy, right? I mean, that's pretty big. Well, we'll go back to that in a second. Let's take a look at what he had with him for his armor. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. And now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. That's between 15 and 16 pounds. It's like a missile on a log. And a shield bearer went before him. So he has about between 150 to 200 pounds of armor on him. He is a large specimen. So let's just go back to who he is, where he came from. He's their champion. And some, I think it was the commenter, Adam Clark, believed that word could be translated. He's like the middleman. He's like the go-between for the Philistines towards their enemies. So he's standing out there representing the Philistines, saying, I will represent them, and we'll see if you will send out a champion to fight against me. He's a giant. If you go back into the Old Testament, there were giants in the world in the days of Noah. They were fallen ones. They were men of renown. And many Bible scholars, I believe also, that they came from the union of fallen angels and women somehow. Again, we don't know how that took place, but that was the relationship in the days of Noah, where the sons of God looked upon women and took wives. And that word for sons of God always has to do with angels, not men. Whether they did it directly or they possessed men, we don't know. But their offspring were giants. They came about again in the days of Moses and Joshua. And you can read Joshua chapter 11. One of the places that they remained in was Gath, this place. How did he come about? Most likely from worship of evil spirits. And this man was proportionate. I mean, there were very large people throughout the world's history. One of them was, I think it was Robert Wadlow, the guy in England. He was 8 foot 11 feet inches, 490 pounds. If you look at a picture of him and you see people next to him, they all look like midgets. He was very tall, kind of lanky looking, died very young. That's not a giant. That's a giant of a man to us. We'd look at him next to some of the guys in the NBA. You got some guys who are over 7 foot 11. Right? Just some big boys out there today. He was a foot taller, but not proportionate. Goliath was proportionate. 6 foot, 6 cubits in a span is over. I mean, that's almost the height of a basketball rim, right? That's a big guy. I can't even touch it. I can't even touch the net, but that's a whole nother story. I used to be able to. Now, imagine that and able to carry 200 pounds of armor on your body with the weapons that he had. This was not the norm. So in the days of Joshua, they had giants in the land, and there's a book on the area of Hebron, of the giants in Hebron, and they had found large structures, large bedposts still intact from then, and even one of them is recorded in the book of Numbers. I believe it was Og, king of Bashan. Again, this is off the cuff. Cubits, 9 cubits or something like that. You're talking about 13 feet in length, possibly. That's a big creature. So giant, Goliath could have been an average-sized giant or a smaller giant. I don't know, but 9 feet 9 inches, large, intimidating, and a warrior from his youth. That's who they have out before them. That sets the stage for 1 Samuel chapter 17. And this took place because Israel wasn't doing its job. The king wasn't doing his job. The one who should be going out to battle against him would be Saul. And I have no doubts Jonathan would go, but Saul's the king. But he's not. Let's look at the response of the Israelites before this champion of Gath. Verse 8 says, "Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, 'Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us.' And the Philistines said, 'I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together.' And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." They're all in terror. And I believe he's just openly mocking them. Give me a man. Aren't you the servants of Saul? Saul, aren't you their king? Aren't you head and shoulders above everybody? Shouldn't you be representing your people? Or send me somebody. He's mocking them. He has instilled fear in their heart. I don't know if you guys remember Michael Spinks when he fought Mike Tyson. Yes, I used to watch boxing. I still might once in a while look at a clip of it. But before he got in the ring with that guy, he lost. He was terrified. You could see the fear in his eyes. Rightly so. He got knocked out quick. But he already lost the battle before he went into the ring. These guys have already lost the battle before anybody would step out against this giant, specifically their king. And that's one of the greatest tactics that the devil has in Christian warfare: fear, intimidation. How many Christians are afraid to step out in faith because they're intimidated by the enemy, by the threats, by the mockery? And he will do that. He will ridicule and mock and say, "Look at you." Because if they were to compare themselves, even Saul, to a man who's 9 feet 9 inches tall, they were small. In the natural, they couldn't win that fight. Logically thinking, just by human standards, you shouldn't go out against that guy because you don't have the weaponry, You don't have the resources. It's not just about numbers at this point. You don't have the actual man and size power to beat a guy like that in the natural. But that's the problem here, because God's people were not a natural-born nation. It was supernaturally born by the true and living God. This is actually a spiritual battle. The reason why they're even in Judah is because they were spiritually compromised at this point, and their king was reprobate. He couldn't fight them. They didn't have a strong leader. He's afraid. They're all afraid. This is satanic victory over God's people. But that's not how God wins, with size. Remember, that's what they wanted, and that's what they got. Give us a king. They got the biggest, best-looking guy from the best family. He failed miserably, and he couldn't stand before their champion. Hudson Taylor said this: all of God's giants have been weak. Men who did great things for God because they reckoned on God being with them. I am the very little servant of an illustrious master. That's the key in victory. That's what they have to learn. And there is a man there who will be there who will prove that. And that's what this whole chapter is about. It's about God being glorified, God being honored, and God giving the victory to men of faith. They lost their vision of God. And so many Christians are afraid to walk with the Lord and be bold for Christ and trust Him, as they've lost their vision of who He is. They got their eyes on men. They got their eyes on themselves, on their own inability, their own smallness. Throughout the history of Israel, you watch God take weak people, people who thought it was, they just couldn't bring anything to the table anymore, like a Moses, right? I can't do this, I can't do that. Or a Gideon who's threshing wheat in a valley, in a wine press, and He raises them up so God gets the glory, not man. The church is the church because of the glory of Christ, not because of the greatness of the church. He's defying them. Fear is a very strong tactic of the enemy. We don't need to fear. We fight from victory, not just for victory. We fight from the victory of the cross. And David understood the greatness of God, which is why God has raised him up. And it's interesting, he's already been anointed king and been trained to fight this guy. Now David, verse 12, was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, who had 8 sons, and the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. Remember, David was the youngest. David would also be considered the 7th, most likely because one had died. We just don't know their name. That was written in Chronicles 400 years later, so the name is removed. 8, by the way, is the number of new beginnings. 7 is the number of completion. 8 is a number of new beginnings. And there is going to be a new beginning here with God's king. No more cowering behind the lines. God's anointed is in the midst. And the interesting thing is they had no idea who it was because they looked at the wrong thing to measure God's glory and God's strength. So it says in verse 13, the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Notice a couple things. 3 of his oldest brothers had gone to follow Saul. Remember that Samuel said, when you get your king, he's going to make your guys go in his army. He's going to pick the best men to be around him. You're going to pay taxes. And by the way, when you went to war, it wasn't like, Saul said, I'm just going to feed you guys and arm you guys. A lot of it was your responsibility. You had to find your own weapons. The only 2 people with swords were Saul and Jonathan. And a lot of the food that you ate came from home. So David, remember, was before Saul playing harp, because he could play, helping him when the devil tormented him. And he was also his armor bearer. Saul loved him, even though he didn't know that God had anointed him to be his replacement. And at times he would go home. What would he do when he went home? He would feed the sheep. And that's just a great measure on faithfulness, by the way. He didn't go home and say, Dad, remember, anointed. Me no watch sheepy anymore. They smell, they're stupid. And by the way, I got a gift. I play the harp. The king likes me. I'm his armor bearer. I'm not coming home. He went home. And he did that simple task because it wasn't below him. This is the heart of a true shepherd. He loved sheep, which is why David will be a great shepherd in Israel, because God's a great shepherd. So he'd go home, take care of the sheep. So his brothers are out there going to war. By the way, his three brothers were rejected as being king because they didn't have the heart like David. David goes home. He's faithful to his dad. And verse 16, and this, by the way, is all setting up the scene for us. The Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. And when you look at the number 40, remember 40 has a biblical meaning as well. 8, the number of new beginnings. 7, the number of completion. 40, the number of testing. The rain came on the earth 40 days and 40 nights in the days of Noah. The Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus was tempted for 40 days and 40 nights by the devil. This man, this creature, this giant is mocking them, testing them, provoking them for 40 days and 40 nights. It's a picture of the devil just trying to afflict them and intimidate them. They are failing the test, by the way. But David is in the midst. God has his man ready to fight. Verse 17 says, Then Jesse said to his son David, Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. They had some skirmishes back and forth, but no real war engagement where Goliath and a champion was involved. Some skirmishes. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army, and David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brother. So here's what he does. His dad says, Dave, come here. All right, take this grain, dry grain, take these 10 loaves, and take these 10 cheeses, get them to your brother, get them to the commander. So what does he do? He says, okay, Dad. Note the mark of a real leader, faithful. He went back home to take care of his sheep. When his dad said, okay, now go, he went. Again, obedient to the leader of the family. It's David. Note that before you fight the big battles, you have to be faithful with the 10 cheeses. I know that sounds ridiculous, but God gives all of us 10 cheeses, gives us some seemingly small thing, some task to carry out. David would not have gone to the front lines if his father didn't tell him to bring the grain and the cheeses to his brothers and to that captain. There is no greater task until the smaller ones are done. And by the way, those small things are really big things. The Holy Spirit has that recorded in the Scripture intentionally for us. Don't pass over the 10 cheeses or the 10 loaves. It's important. Don't pass over the fact that he left the sheep in the hands of somebody who could take care of him. He didn't just run away. Who cares about the sheep anymore? He actually cared for the sheep that he was no longer going to be shepherding. Like Jesus, before he went to the cross and went to the throne, he kept them all the way to the end. And when he went to the Father, he didn't leave us orphans, comfortless. Jesus cares for us. David cares for his sheep. David also is interested in the battle. Very interesting. He runs out to the battle. He sees what's going on. He greets his brother in verse 23. As this scene is building, as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. Again, fear causing them to shrink back. And so the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. And then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so it shall be done for the man who kills him. As he comes to the forefront again, he has struck terror in their hearts, and their whole conversation. Has he seen this guy? He's defying Israel. Nobody has the strength, the spiritual spine, to stand up and to take him on. And the reason, again, is fear. They're measuring Goliath by the outward. They are not looking to God. They're looking on the horizontal. Oftentimes, this is our problem. We're looking towards man. We're looking towards our peers. We're looking around us instead of looking up. Now, what Saul had done was he had gave them people an opportunity. Whoever kills them, I'll give you a great reward. I'll give you my daughter. Not such a great reward, but you hand her off anyway. And you're exempt from taxes. Now, so if anybody's fighting, what are they fighting for? Fighting for money, right? What you've done by giving somebody money to do God's business is you made them a mercenary. You've made them a hireling. And this, by the way, this can say it happened in a church too. You just hire somebody, and they become a hireling. They become, well, where's my cash? And then I'll serve God. That's not the right reason for serving God. David, listen to what he says. David says, what shall be done? Okay, so he's listening to him. For the guy who kills him, right, what shall be done? But notice what he adds in here that nobody else adds. Who kills the Philistine, verse 26, and takes away the reproach of Israel. You see where David's heart is? Yeah, he's listening. So you get who? You get what? What's going on here? He's listening. He says, but who takes away the reproach of Israel? In other words, David's saying this guy is reproaching Israel. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? It wasn't even about the armies or just Israel. Remember, Israel means governed by God. He's saying this guy's reproaching God. Who's going to kill this guy? He's about 18 years old. I like it. All these guys are, 20s, maybe 30s. Oh, man, he's big. Oh, man, he's got a big spear. He's got big, sharp teeth. He's probably got big, bad breath. He'll probably eat us. And he might have. I don't know. He probably did. But they're looking at this guy. They're terrified. And this young guy comes out. I like what Paul said. Don't let anybody despise your youth. This young guy comes out, anointed by God, and he sees the problem. He's reproaching God. I don't like that guy. Who's this uncircumcised Philistine? He has no covenant with God. Look at verse 28. It's interesting because David, everybody else there is crumbling into fear. And that's one of the biggest things that the enemy does. But he also uses some other things to stop us from being faithful to God. And one of them can come from the closest people to us. Even our family. Look. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. And Eliab's anger was aroused against David. Interesting. David's saying, Who's this guy to defy God? Who's this guy to defy the armies of God? What's he talking about? What happens to the guy who takes away the reproach of Israel? Eliab is angry against David. And he said, why did you come down here? The answer is, well, Dad sent me. 10 cheeses. And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Accusation. Why have you come down here? Accusation. Well, who's got those sheep? Accusation. I know your pride. Really? Do you? And the insolence of your heart. For you have come down to see the battle. Now, there's a few things here. Remember, Jesus said, your enemies could be those of your own household. Not always the case, but it could be. It happened with Jesus. His own brothers thought he was crazy at one point. Even his mother thought he had been beside himself. Why would Eliab, the oldest, say this about the youngest? Well, I think there's a couple reasons. Number one, if you look at the situation, they thought lowly of David. Remember, he's the youngest. He's the eighth. His own dad didn't even call him by name. He said, there was one left out in the field. Bring him in here. Who is he? I don't know. Number 8. Thought lowly of him because oftentimes the youngest was seen as the lowest. I think he judged him in his motive because he himself was a coward. Now, I'm not saying he was a coward in every situation because I don't know Eliab, but when I see him in heaven, I don't want to be like, hey, called you a coward. Sorry. It was a Wednesday night Bible study. I knew you weren't there. But in this situation, he wasn't stepping up. I believe he knew David was right. I believe he was convicted by David's boldness, his fearlessness. I also believe he was jealous. He should have been the one saying, who is this guy, right? And sometimes the biggest battle that we have to push through are the people closest to us trying to discourage us from serving God. Because sometimes they think they know us the best. I've known you, you're the youngest, you're the brat out in the field. Where's the sheep? Well, he did. He was faithful. He left the sheep with somebody. I know your motive. You do. Only God knows the ultimate motive of a heart, right? He's the one who searches the hearts and the minds. An accusation. Trying to push him back so he wouldn't be used by God. And the enemy often uses that, right? Fear, intimidation, accusation. And David is pushing through this battle of words before he faces the battle of a sword and a giant. And so often we have to face the same thing. Who do you think you are? And a person just trying to put you down, trying to cut your legs out from underneath you spiritually when you're trying to serve God. And it hurts when it's the closest one to you. David's answer, verse 29, what have I done now? that smacks of, I've heard this a lot. Now what have I done, right? What have I done now? Is there not a cause? And that is his answer. Isn't there a cause? Yeah, there's a cause. There's a righteous cause. That guy needs to be taken off planet Earth. That guy is defying God. And then in verse 30, he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones. What did he do? He took his attention away from the negative words, from the put down, and talked to somebody else. That's bold, right? That's a guy who's trusting the Lord. He says, hey, you know what? Okay, so what's going on here? And the guy says, well, this is what's going to happen. Now, verse 34, things begin to pick up. Now, when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. And then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Now, again, a lot of Bible scholars believe he's 18 years old. So here comes this stripling, right? You can think about an 18-year-old. They've reached about the height they're going to be. Testosterone's kicking in. lean, kind of muscly, right? Not fully developed. You get into your mid to late 20s, you start really developing around the mid section. David has none of that. He is telling everybody, hey, calm down. I know this looks bad. I got it under control. How old are you? Doesn't matter. I'll go out and fight this guy. Saul had heard somebody out there is talking like they might want to go out and fight their champion. Bring him to me. And David shows up. I said, bring him to me. That's him. Everything's okay. But it was because God had raised this young man up. Now, here's more words that he has to fight against. Because Saul doesn't encourage him at first. Look at what he says. Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he's a man of war from his youth. David, it doesn't make sense. You mean well, but you're not able to do this. How often does the devil stop us in our tracks when God's moving his head? When he says, you can't do this. Look at you. Again, logically speaking, it would not make sense for an 18-year-old shepherd to fight a giant who's been warring since his youth. But that doesn't stop David. Look at David's answer. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep. You see that? Used to keep his father's sheep. Now, he's not saying I'm not a shepherd anymore, but he knows in his heart there's a change now. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both a lion and a bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing, here's the point, he has defied the armies of the living God. And beyond that, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. What did David say in response to that? Okay, I get it. You're looking at me, and I know I'm not much. I'm not just a harpist. I'm not just a shepherd. As a matter of fact, when I used to do that, I had battles. Nobody saw them. It was just me and the sheep and God. And by the way, if we want to be used by God, we will have private battles that nobody else sees. Because the devil will come to go to war against us in the privacy of our life. And that's where we have to learn to fight with God, not when everybody's watching, but when there's nobody watching. David said, when I was out in the field, a lion came. I didn't run. The natural response would be take off. Now, I don't know about you. If I saw a lion without a rifle, I'm gone. I'm not saying I'd leave you here. I'd say, run with me this way. And you would too. That's just natural, right? But he's saying, I didn't take off. I fought it. I killed it. And when a bear came, I didn't run. I fought it and I killed it. And I was able to do that because God delivered them into my hand. In other words, I've already warred with God against animals worse than that guy. I'm not afraid of him because God has already proved himself to me. David has a shepherd's heart. He's not afraid to lay down his life for the sheep. By the way, that's a real shepherd. The hireling flees when the wolf comes. The shepherd doesn't do that. He had precedent in his life. God already showed me how to win by God. If I stand there and I fight the battle he wants me to fight in his power, he will deliver me. It'll still be a fight. The lion didn't just roll over and have a heart attack. The bear didn't just choke to death on its own. David had to kill it. David had to pick up whatever weapon he had, use his hands, take it by the beard, strike it, but God taught him how to fight. It's the same thing with us. There are private battles in our life. There are many men, many women who want to be involved with ministry, and they will battle the enemy on their own in the privacy of their mind or at work or in their homes, and they have to learn. We have to learn how to do battle and to learn victory there. Battling lust in the privacy of our minds, right? Temptation, trials, all those things that come our way that will try to knock us off course, that God will show himself victorious there before you're in the public eye. How many people end up failing in the public eye because they didn't win the victory in the private place? And I don't care what battle it is that God allows us to go into. If he allows the temptation, if he allows the lion, Satan, the bear, Russia, I just had to throw something out there. I didn't have one for the bear. If he has something attacking us, that means he will give us the ability to fight and the strength to fight. You have to learn that. That's why David wasn't afraid. He's like, I'm not saying I could do it on my own. This is about God. And if you look at David's whole motive, this is about God. This is about me. You know, a lot of times we look at this chapter and we think, okay, where's the Goliath in my life that I have to fight? And there are Goliaths that we have to fight. You can make practical applications, right? The Goliath of temptation, the Goliath of workplace persecution, the Goliath of sickness, the Goliath of your marriage, maybe, really. The Goliath of getting up in the morning for some people, the Goliath of depression, of poverty. All those things are very real battles we have to face. But the biggest thing on David's heart is God's glory. Why is he even engaging in this fight? See, Goliath didn't seek David out. David went after him because he is attacking the glory of God. And he is going to be victorious because of God, not because of himself. And he had already won those private battles because of God. It's a really important lesson for all of us to win alone with nobody else looking. It's easy to put on a show and impress people in the flesh, but what about the privacy of our hearts? When only God sees. That's where David had already won and proved God. He's got precedent. And the same thing for us, that God has already given us the victory in Christ by going to the cross, dying for our sins, bearing the wrath of God, crushing Satan's power over us. Doesn't mean that we won't be persecuted, tempted. Doesn't mean we can't have our lives taken from us. All those things are a fact that can happen to us. But the victory has been given. He's already been defeated. We're in Christ. Anything that comes our way that God allows, we can have victory. We may have ups and downs. We may trip, fall, stumble, lose some battles, but God will teach us how to win. And when we win one victory, there's going to be another battle, and another battle, and another battle, and another battle, until the final battle, which is death, which God prepares us for. All the way to the end, we learn how to trust God and fight from victory that he's given to us. It's not our strength, it's his strength. It's not about our reputation and glory, it's about his. And that's why God raised David up. That's why he's able to say these things. Look at Saul. He says, "Go, and the Lord be with you." And so, verse 38, so Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. Wise. Okay, so Saul says, well, look, if you're going to go out, you're going to fight this guy, if you're going to have a chance at all, you're going to have to put my stuff on you. First of all, he's huge, so it's not going to fit him. Second of all, that's not how David learned how to fight. When he beat the bear and the lion, all he had was a shepherd's staff, a sling, and a stone. Maybe a small weapon. We don't know too much about that, but that's it. So he puts it on. I think out of due respect to Saul, like, okay, I'll try it on. And it doesn't fit. I haven't tested it. Two problems. Saul is looking at him in the flesh. You need my stuff. Now, this is a spiritual battle. You don't need to be armed with the strength and the military technology of a man for this battle. He needs to be armed in the power of God, and he needs to fight as he knows how to fight. In other words, walk in your own shoes. Don't try to imitate somebody else. Don't try to be somebody else. David wisely, respectfully says, I haven't tested these. I will use what I'm used to. And for all of us, God equips us in a unique way to be ourselves, to fight in a way that God has trained us, to do spiritual battle. We all have the armor of God given to us. Ephesians chapter 6, every one of us. But Paul says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. And the weapons of our warfare, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, are not carnal, but spiritual. They're powerful. They're mighty through God. But you have to learn how to use those yourself too. The question is, with the weapons that God has given all of us, have we tested them? Have we used them? David has used his own armor that God had given to him, a staff, a sling, a stones, his presence. Do we use them? Can we say the same thing and be confident? Like, you know what? Every day I get up, go out to face whatever God has before me with him as myself, and not to be somebody else, but somebody else's personality on, somebody else's abilities on. I just have to be myself. And that I've walked with the Lord, and I've used the spiritual weapons that he's given to me to do battle against the enemy. We have to personally do that. David was able to do that. He put his stuff off. It says in verse 40, then he took his staff in his hand. He chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag and a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistines. Now, some people say, why do he have 5 smooth stones? Why not just one? If he had faith in God, why has he got 5? Think he's going to miss? Well, Goliath had 4 sons. I believe that he was ready to kill the 4 sons. If he kills dad, you know the 4 sons are going to come after him. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill his kids. Now, this sounds kind of violent, doesn't it? It's Old Testament. It's okay. This is a good execution because he's a wicked man that's defying God. David picks up 5 smooth stones, puts them in his bag, and look at verse 40. He draws near to the Philistine. And so the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, the idea there, he's looking around, like, where's the guy? Looks out, and he looks down, and there's David. You? Look at what he says. He disdained him. You? For he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Now, the word dog there could mean, dog. But some believe, because it's the same word used in Deuteronomy, talking about a sodomite, that he's making a specific reference to being unmanly. What am I? Questioning my manhood? You send that boy out here with a stick and stones? The Philistines said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. I'll tell you what, if I saw a 9'9" guy with a big staff, with a big iron spear, 16 pounds, ready to throw that through my chest and saying, I'm going to feed your flesh to the beasts of the field, I might think twice. Just being honest. He's going face to face with a guy who's going to kill him mercilessly. David's response is so encouraging. He's fearless. David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you've defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth, here's his purpose, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. You think you're going to kill me? I'm going to cut your head off. With what? Your stick? David already knows you're dead. You know why you're dead? Because of God, not because of me. And I'm not only going to cut your head off, I'm going to feed your carcass and the carcass of the entire camp to the birds of the field. In other words, Israel's going to win, not just you. See, Goliath's saying, I'm going to get glory. David didn't say, I'm going to get glory. God's going to get glory. And God's people are going to be blessed because you defied God. That's supposed to be the motive for all of us to serve him. God. Not us. God. And he was right. He said, after this battle that you will lose, I wonder if Goliath was thinking, will I lose? He's got guts. I mean, he's speaking confidently. Nobody ever talked to Goliath like that. He's telling me he's going to cut my head off. Everybody in the world is going to know this story. And he's right. He woke up that morning taking care of sheep, taking cheese out to his brothers. Take the cheese and the bread out there. Okay, Dad. Shows up, and God is just so awesome in how he lines things up. This is the day. This was on God's heart. This is the day David's getting raised up in front of everybody. And he wasn't looking for it. He didn't force this. He didn't wake up in the morning, you know what? I think I'm going to make this happen where I'm going to go out there and fight Goliath. He just showed up. Who's this guy? He had to push through their fear. He had to push through a mercenary mindset. He had to push past his own brother's anger and accusation. He had to push past the king, the wisest one, saying, you can't do this. He had to know in his heart, no, I can, not because of me, but because of God. And I've already been trained by God. I've already proven God. He's already won for me. I already beat a lion. I already beat a bear. I could do this. Why? Not for me. This isn't for David. This is for God. And here we are, thousands of years later, still getting encouraged that God doesn't need the weapons of man. God doesn't need the strength of man. God needs himself. And anybody who's available to give God the glory in weakness. That's the beauty of this story. God does it. That's why David's kingdom would be so awesome, because it was all about God, not about David. That's why God raised him up. That's why God gave him this great victory. Now, he still had to fight. He still had to go forward and fight this guy. And so it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David that David hurried. You got that? He hurried. He ran toward the army to meet the Philistines. He is engaged. He's not kind of, in the movies they always have him like going back and forth at lateral movements and trying to figure out. That's not what's going on. He runs right at him. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. Game's over. That must have been really anticlimactic for the Philistines, terrifying, We just watched a 9'9" monster get dropped by a rock. They were hoping for a shish kebab Jew. And then a romp on Israel. God had turned the entire battle upside down with a boy, a sling. And by the way, he had to be accurate. He had to practice. He had to use that thing and know how to use that thing. But ultimately who sunk that rock into Goliath's head. God said, I'm going to put that right into your head, buddy. Dead. And everybody that day knew God did it. Because David trusted God. He was fearless. He was skilled. And he ran into that battle like nobody else did because God raised him up. If he wasn't trained by God, if the Spirit of God wasn't upon him, he would have lost. He would have been a shish kebab. Israel would have been in bondage. But God had his man who loved God, who trusted God, who already fought with God, was trained by God in the private place without the glory of man, faithful in the small things, faithful to the sheep, faithful in delivering the food to his brothers and to the captain of the army, faithful to God, pushing past discouragement, pushing past accusation, going forward as himself. And Peter tells us, if you're going to minister with what God has gifted you in so that God gets the glory. Now, don't be somebody else. Be yourself as God made you to be with the power of God and give God the glory. And the entire nation of Israel was blessed because he was faithful to God. And he wanted God to be glorified. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. Notice the emphasis is it was the stone that did it. He didn't need the sword, but he finishes him off here. There was no sword in the hand of David, therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Can you imagine that scene? Goliath drops. They're shocked. David runs up. They're watching this champion. This young guy stands on top, takes the sword out. I'm going to add this. Points at him. I would have. Takes the sword, takes his head off. It is over. They're terrified. And maybe he said, I told you. Because he defied God. God judges the wicked with his own sword. We'll finish this out. See, the red clock's not on tonight, so it might be like 10 o'clock at night. I'm still going. What time is it? 8:18? Oh, we got plenty of time. We're going to chapter 18 tonight and finish it. We're almost done. Look at verse 52. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted. Don't you love this? When somebody is serving the Lord and they get victory, everybody else is encouraged, and they pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron, and the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Sharim, even as far as Gath and Ekron, and then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. Why? Because God was glorified. Why? Because there was a faithful man who was willing to trust God and stand for God, because God was being reproached and he wouldn't stand for it. David fought from victory, and the whole nation was blessed because of it. We fight from victory, from the cross and the resurrection of Christ, and God blesses the church because of it. When we do what we do for God's glory, trusting him and pointing to him. You see, this was all about God getting glory. You'd go home that day and say, great kid, love him, maybe he'll be king one day. That was all about God. That had to be God. Man, that stone went right into his head. Man, what a sight. I hated that guy. He threatened us, tortured us. I was afraid of getting speared by that guy, and his kid shows up and talks about God, takes him out, and we won that day, and we plundered them that day. We drove them out of the land that day. He took back ground that the devil had taken from God's people. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. He probably pickled it. Put his armor in his hand. You know, you might look at that and say, like, ew, he took his head back. Hey, look, that was like, what'd you do today? Look, Mom. Whose head? Is that Goliath's head? Look at the size of it. It must have been like this. Look at that thing. Yeah. Not because they're sick and they want dead heads around. He was an evil man. He afflicted the people of God. That and his sword and his weapons showed the power of God that day. He took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. Now, I don't think they talk like that. But I think it's interesting. Whose son is that? You know, it wasn't that long ago that David's playing the harp before him. He found out that he was the son of Jesse. Some believe, well, maybe David, went from 16 to 18. He looked a little bit different because he got a little bit older. It's possible. But sometimes it's just because he's not focused on what God's doing right in front of him. He's reprobated this time. Whose son is that? You got to be kidding me. He was your armor bearer. You looked at him and you loved him. Somebody said, there are people who make things happen, there are people who watch things happen, and then there's people who don't know anything that's happening. That's what's going on. Well, what's going on out there? Whose son is that? I don't know. God raised up your replacement. God raised up a man after his own heart. God just took out your enemy through that kid. And the people are blessed. It should have been you. And remember, why did Saul get removed? Stubbornness. Rebellion. Sacrificing when he shouldn't have sacrificed. Not finishing off Agag when he was supposed to keep the best stuff for himself. David finished off Goliath for God's glory. That's why things are happening. So the king said, well, inquire whose son this young man is. And then as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? So David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. So we'll end there tonight. So for us, a couple encouraging things just to remember. Number one, all of us, every one of us, we've been given the weapons of God, all of us. God doesn't hold them back, gives some more than others. He gives different gifts to different people, but he gives us all the spiritual armor. Why? Because we all have the same enemy. We all have the same enemy without the devil, the world, and the flesh. The victory that he's given us over the world is our faith, not our own strength, trusting in him because of what Christ has done on the cross. We fight from victory, and then we fight for victory by the power of God. Something for all of us to remember. It's in the privacy, the area of our mind and our home life, thought life, our words, our battle with the enemy alone. That's where it counts before the big battles, right? Those bigger ones in the public sector. Are we faithful there? God wants us to be faithful. And even if we never get some public recognition of taking out a Goliath or doing some really big thing for God, it's big for us to be obedient to God. That God could look at our heart and say, that one right there. Even if other people get him wrong, that one. I know that one. Because God doesn't see as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance. God looks on the heart.